however talented you are as a retoucher, the output retouched image is always going to be relative to the input, the original file. If the input is of low quality, the chances are the output is going to end up looking a bit like a crude painting with a completely unnatural finish. A key skill as a retoucher is the ability to assess the input and to determine whether it's technically worthy of the considerable amount of work you're going to put into the retouching. Many of the variables that determine the quality of the image are locked down at the moment of capture by the photographer. So if you are the photographer, then you can make sure that you give yourself a technically high quality file to retouch. If you're a retoucher who uses stock images or receives files from clients, you may have to take a deep breath and ask if there's an alternative exposure. For example, if the file is underexposed or not focused sharp enough. These are only a couple of the things that we have to look out for. As well as the sharpness and the exposure, we have to be aware of resolution and color gamut, compression, capture sharpening, gradients, banding, and noise. And be aware of strange things such as chromatic aberration and moire effects. Sharpness in an original file is all about the focus and the sharpness of the lens. A portrait is usually focused on the eyes and not on the background. There's a lot of unintentional back focusing going on amongst photographers using autofocus, where the focus grabs the background instead of the subject. This can't really be fixed in Photoshop. If you've watched certain TV crime programs, you'll be led to believe that a blurry blob of an eye can be optimized and sharpened to become a detailed iris. This is categorically not correct. If a blob is sharpened, it only enhances the contrast of any edges within the blob. It cannot bring out more actual detail. So if your portrait's eyelashes are just one big blob, they'll only become a slightly more defined blob when you sharpen it digitally. It won't ever become a refined set of separate lashes, as in a correctly focused image. Resolution is a bit of a fluid concept. What we always need to check is the file size in megabytes rather than just resolution. Looking at it pedantically, you can have a 300 ppi high resolution image, but if it's only an inch in size, it's no bigger than a postage stamp. On the other hand, you can have a 100 megabyte file at a low res of 72 ppi, and it can print out as big as a poster. But pretty much everyone understands that high res image to be a big file size. So let's look at some standards. Take, for example, a 25 megabyte file. That's pretty much a standard letter size if you print it at 300 ppi. If you have twice that size, around 50 megabytes, then you have an ample enough image for a magazine DPS. That's a double page spread or an A3. Don't be too quick when you check the megabyte file size. If the file is in 16 bits, it'll show up twice as big as an 8-bit in megabytes. So do double check and look in the bar at the top of the image to check whether it's 16 or 8 bits. The camera's capture format can make a big difference. The advantage of RAW is massive because there's such flexibility after the capture compared to JPEGs where the processing is already set in stone. With RAW, you can adjust the exposure and rescue some highlights and change the white balance after the capture. If you have the option of a RAW file and a JPEG, take the RAW option anytime. If you download stock images, you might find that they've been compressed quite badly as JPEGs. What often happens is that they're worked on as JPEGs, then saved again as JPEG. You end up with a file with JPEG artifacts from the compression. TIFF files shouldn't have any lossy compression artifacts, even if they are saved as LZW compression, but you never know. They could have had a history of being JPEGs before they landed on your desk. The long and short of it is that you want the original file to be as untouched as possible so that you, the retoucher, can work with pure and unmanipulated pixels. Exposure is seldom 100% perfect, but it shouldn't be more than a stop underexposed and hopefully not more than a stop overexposed either. In fact, it's better that a raw image is slightly overexposed, because you can rescue a stop of highlights if it comes to that. If an image is underexposed, as it often is by overcautious photographers, the shadow information can really suffer and it becomes noisy in the shadows when you make brightness adjustments. A well-exposed histogram should generally have information that goes all the way to the right in the highlights and all the way to the left in the shadows. But not all images are created alike. Some high-key images barely have any shadows at all, and low-key shots don't always have any significant highlights. Color gamut is one of those things that can really trip you up. First, you need to consider which flavor of RGB to use for your files. Do check out the color management tutorial, because it's a real complex issue and you can't just avoid it. When we talk about out of gamut color, it literally means color that doesn't convert well from RGB mode to CMYK for printing. This is a real challenge. Whatever flavor of CMYK your output may be, whether it's offset press or your RGB inkjet printer. RGB printers are actually CMYK, but they have RGB drivers. So even though inkjets generally have large gamuts, they have their limitations. If you've accidentally clipped an image, say in the highlights, it may be that your blue colors are too pure, so that it lacks the complexity that it needs in order to convert to a good CMYK print blue. You'll find that when you print the image, the blues go dull and dark. If the red channel has been clipped, you'll find that the skin tones also fall out of printable gamut and can cause breakups within the skin, so you lose that lovely gradient smoothness. In the end, this also comes down to exposure and the processing of the captured file. Bright colours are always in danger of being oversaturated to the extent that they fall out of gamut. So don't put any saturation or vibrance on until you've checked the gamut warning and the soft proofing in Photoshop. More about that in the colour management tutorial. Digital sharpening, or capture sharpening as we like to call it, it's not the same as focus sharpness. I've seen a lot of images with too much input sharpening, which happens very often in the actual processing in, say, Capture One, Adobe Camera Raw, and very often in JPEGs. The default settings of your RAW converter might not be the ideal settings for the subject that you're working on. I prefer to use a very low level of sharpening or no sharpening at all on files that I'm going to retouch. Digital sharpening is actually only a contrast enhancement which latches onto texture and exaggerates pores and blemishes. So the more times you sharpen, the less refined and more coarse the image will become. I think it's much better to start with a slightly soft but well-focused file and then sharpen it just right for the output. Noise is a bit of a problem with underexposed images, but it can also occur on shoots using a high ISO. In the best of cases, this noise can resemble grain, and sometimes it actually suits the image, but most of the time when it comes to beauty retouching, you do want noise-free images. There is good noise and bad noise. Noise in hair is usually always bad, and no matter how clever the noise reduction plugin you use, you will lose some definition in the detailed areas, such as hair and lashes and clothes and backgrounds, etc. There's a low level of noise in all photographs, which is not really visible, but we're very quick to notice it when it's no longer there. And this noise helps to hold all those smooth gradients together. So unless you have an obvious need for noise removal, don't use any noise plugins or noise removal filters. Banding and breakups can be an insidious problem, especially in strongly coloured paper backgrounds, and sometimes also in skin. I find that backgrounds that have been lit with too dramatic gradients and with too much saturation or in complete monochrome may easily break into these visible bands where there should be smooth transitions. You may think that blurring will actually help to smooth them out, but it's quite the opposite. Blurring makes it worse. There are only two things really that can improve on banding. One is to work in 16-bit mode, where the color calculations are a bit cleverer. Photoshop literally has finer steps of color in 16 bits. The other remedy for banding and mild posterization is to put noise on it. This will create some pixel variation, and that may obscure the banding. But I'm sure you know what I'm going to say now. Go back to the drawing board and process out the image again, and this time a little bit flatter, and reduce the steepness of the vignette or the gradient. If you can't reject files, at least you then can know what you're up against, and you can plan your editing and allow time for dealing with those technical flaws. It's not a nice thing to have to give a client a disclaimer, but if you feel it's necessary, it's better that it comes before the retouching rather than after the fact. It's also good to know that if you have an input capture that has the necessary sharpness and a good exposure and a decent gamut that will convert well to CMYK, a non-compressed input with no artifacts at all, you can enlarge it to 3 times its original file and do some really nice retouching work and feel that it's worth it. If your retouching is done well, you can expect an output that doesn't look like a painting and that really retains believability and can even be suitable for a poster.